Betrayed in the Shadows, the mineshaft murder of Emily Carlisle. Quiet town of Ashwood. The town of Ashwood was a place where the rhythm of life had remained unchanged for decades. Nestled deep in the Pennsylvania hills, it was a community built around the coal mines that had sustained generations. The streets were lined with old, brick houses, their facades weathered by time but still standing as proud testaments to the hard work of the miners who lived within them. The air in Ashwood was often tinged with the scent of coal dust, a reminder of the town's lifeblood. The mines had brought prosperity, but they had also brought tragedy, with many a family losing loved ones to the treacherous depths. Among the town's residents were Emily and Daniel Carlisle, a couple who had grown up in Ashwood and seemed destined to live out their lives there. Emily was the daughter of a local schoolteacher, known for her beauty and kind nature. She was the girl everyone in town admired, always smiling, always willing to lend a hand. Daniel, her high school sweetheart, was a man of few words but many deeds. He worked as a supervisor at the very mine that had been the backbone of Ashwood's economy for as long as anyone could remember. Tall and sturdy, with a kind of quiet strength that others looked up to, Daniel was respected by his peers and loved by Emily. The Carlisles were a perfect couple, or so it seemed. They had married young, shortly after graduating high school, and had settled into a comfortable life. Their home was a cozy two-story house on Elm Street, with a white picket fence and a well-tended garden that Emily took great pride in. To the outside world, their life was idyllic. Emily was often seen walking through town, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, her blue eyes sparkling with joy. She volunteered at the local church, baked pies for community events, and was always ready with a kind word for anyone who needed it. Daniel was the steadfast provider, working long hours at the mine to ensure that Emily wanted for nothing. They were, by all appearances, the epitome of small-town happiness. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form in the Carlisles' seemingly perfect marriage. Daniel's long hours at the mine left Emily lonely and yearning for more than the quiet life she had known for so long. She had dreams, once, dreams of traveling, of seeing the world beyond the confines of Ashwood. But those dreams had faded over the years, replaced by the routines of daily life. Emily loved Daniel, of that she was certain, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. And it was in that void that trouble began to brew. The town of Ashwood had a way of keeping secrets. It was a place where gossip spread quickly, but only the surface-level stories made it into the light of day. The deeper, darker secrets were whispered behind closed doors, never to be spoken of in public. Emily's affair was one of those secrets. It started innocently enough, with a smile exchanged in passing, a lingering glance that held more than just polite interest. The object of Emily's attention was a man named Jack Morrison, a drifter who had come to Ashwood seeking work in the mines. Jack was everything that Daniel was not, charming, mysterious, and full of stories about the world beyond Ashwood. He was the spark that reignited the fire in Emily's heart, the escape she had been longing for. Their affair began in secret, with stolen moments in secluded corners of town, away from prying eyes. Emily knew it was wrong, knew that she was betraying the man who had loved her unconditionally for years. But she couldn't stop herself. Jack was intoxicating, and in his arms, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The thrill of the forbidden consumed her, and before long, the affair became more than just a fleeting distraction. It became an obsession. Emily's behavior began to change. She became more distant from Daniel, more secretive. She would leave the house under the guise of running errands, only to meet Jack in the woods on the outskirts of town. Their meetings were passionate, but always tinged with a sense of danger. Emily knew that if they were caught, the consequences would be dire. But the risk only made the affair more exhilarating, more addictive. As the weeks went on, Emily found herself growing increasingly conflicted. She loved Daniel, or at least she believed she did, but her feelings for Jack were undeniable. She was caught in a web of her own making, unable to see a way out that didn't end in heartbreak. And then, just as the affair was reaching its peak, Emily discovered she was pregnant. The news should have brought joy, but instead, it filled her with dread. The timing was too perfect to be Daniel's, and she knew that the truth would destroy him. She was trapped, and the walls were closing in around her. But even as she wrestled with the fear and guilt, she couldn't bring herself to end the affair. She was in too deep, and the secrets she carried were too heavy to bear alone. The town of Ashwood, with its quiet streets and friendly faces, had no idea of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Emily Carlisle, the golden girl of Ashwood, was about to be caught in a whirlwind of deceit and betrayal that would shatter the illusion of her perfect life and lead to a tragedy that would haunt the town for years to come. A tangled web of deceit. The days following Emily's discovery of her pregnancy were a blur of anxiety and fear. The once simple life she had shared with Daniel now felt like a fragile house of cards, each secret threatening to bring the whole structure tumbling down. As she went about her daily routine, she couldn't shake the weight of the knowledge that her affair with Jack Morrison had crossed an irreversible line. The baby growing inside her was a constant reminder of her betrayal, and the guilt gnawed at her from the inside out. Emily found herself pulling away from Daniel even more, unable to face him without the crushing guilt nearly suffocating her. He noticed her change in behavior, of course. How could he not? But Daniel was a man who had always believed in giving people their space. He assumed Emily was just going through a rough patch, maybe feeling the strain of living in such a small town where the monotony of life could weigh heavily on the soul. He didn't press her, didn't ask too many questions. He simply continued with his work at the mine, his days blending into one another as the routine he'd known for so long became his solace. But Emily's affair was not as secret as she believed. In a town like Ashwood, where everyone knew everyone else's business, it was only a matter of time before whispers began to spread. The first to notice was Maggie O'Hara, the town's biggest gossip and a woman with an eye for details. She had seen Emily sneaking off to meet Jack on more than one occasion, and the pieces quickly fell into place. Maggie kept her observations to herself at first, content to watch the drama unfold from a distance. But as the weeks went by, the temptation to share what she knew became too strong to resist. It started with a casual comment here and there, dropped into conversations with the ladies at the local diner. "Have you noticed how distant Emily's been lately?" Maggie would say, her tone innocent but her eyes sharp. "And Jack Morrison? Doesn't he seem to be spending a lot of time on the outskirts of town? Almost like he's waiting for someone." The seed was planted, and soon, the rumors began to take root. Emily, oblivious to the fact that her secret was slowly unraveling, continued to meet Jack in the woods. But the thrill of their encounters was beginning to wear off, replaced by a growing sense of dread. She knew she couldn't keep up the charade forever, but she was paralyzed by fear of what would happen if the truth came out. Jack, for his part, was starting to feel the pressure as well. The passion they had shared was being overshadowed by the reality of their situation, and he could see the cracks forming in Emily's resolve. One afternoon, as they lay together on a blanket in the secluded grove that had become their meeting place, Jack noticed the tension in Emily's face. "You're not yourself today," he said, brushing a strand of hair away from her forehead. "What's going on?" Emily hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to confide in him, to tell him about the pregnancy, but the words caught in her throat. "It's nothing," she finally said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Jack didn't press her, but he could sense that something was wrong. The carefree, passionate woman he had fallen for was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone who was constantly on edge, constantly looking over her shoulder. The weight of their affair was taking its toll, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was worth it. Meanwhile, back in town, the rumors had reached a fever pitch. Maggie O'Hara's little comments had done their work, and now, the entire town was buzzing with speculation about what was really going on between Emily Carlisle and Jack Morrison. The whispers followed Emily wherever she went, at the grocery store, at church, even in her own home, as the phone rang more frequently with calls from concerned friends offering their unsolicited advice. But no one had the courage to confront her directly. After all, Emily was still the town's golden girl, and the idea of her being involved in something so scandalous was almost too much to believe. Except for Daniel. He had noticed the change in the way people looked at him, the way conversations would abruptly stop whenever he walked into a room. It wasn't long before he started putting the pieces together, fueled by the subtle but unmistakable shift in Emily's demeanor. Daniel had always trusted his wife implicitly, but now, doubt began to creep into his mind. He started to replay moments in his head, times when Emily had been distant, when she had gone out without telling him where she was going, when she had seemed lost in thought, her mind a million miles away. One evening, Daniel came home early from the mine, his hands dirty and his body exhausted from the day's labor. As he walked through the front door, he found Emily sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window with a faraway look in her eyes. She didn't even notice him come in until he cleared his throat. Startled, she turned to face him, her expression quickly shifting to one of forced cheerfulness. "Daniel, you're home early," she said, standing up to greet him. He studied her face, searching for any sign that she might be hiding something. "Yeah, we finished up early today," he replied, his voice calm but laced with a tension that Emily couldn't quite place. "Emily, is everything okay?" Her heart skipped a beat at the question, but she managed to keep her composure. "Of course, why wouldn't it be?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. He took a step closer to her, his eyes locked on hers. "I don't know. You just seem different lately." The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in around Emily as she struggled to maintain her facade. She could feel the weight of her lies pressing down on her, and for a moment, she considered telling Daniel the truth. But the fear of what might happen if she did was too great. So instead, she reached out and took his hand, forcing a smile onto her face. "I'm just tired. That's all," she said softly. "It's been a long few weeks." Daniel nodded, but the doubt remained in his eyes. He didn't push the matter any further that night, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before it grew into something more. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the Carlisle household became unbearable. Emily was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, unable to escape the consequences of her actions. The love she had once felt for Daniel had been overshadowed by guilt and fear, and even her feelings for Jack were becoming tainted by the realization that their affair had been a terrible mistake. But the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. And in the quiet town of Ashwood, where the shadows of the past were never far from the surface, the stage was being set for a tragedy that would shock the entire community and leave a stain on the town's history that would never be forgotten. The shadow of truth. The tension in the Carlisle household was palpable, thick as the coal dust that settled over Ashwood every evening. Emily could feel it in every breath, in every glance Daniel cast her way. She knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, before the fragile walls she had built around her secrets crumbled. The stress was beginning to take its toll on her body, and the pregnancy, which she still hadn't revealed to anyone, weighed heavily on her mind. She knew she couldn't hide it forever, but the thought of what would happen when Daniel found out paralyzed her. Meanwhile, Daniel's suspicions were growing. He was a man of routine, a man who knew every detail of his life, like the back of his hand. But recently, things had started to feel off-kilter, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. Emily's behavior was the most obvious sign. She was more distant, more distracted, and often seemed lost in her own thoughts. There were also the little things he noticed around the house, unexplained absences, late-night phone calls that abruptly ended when he entered the room, and the way she avoided his touch when they lay in bed at night. Daniel wasn't a man who easily gave into paranoia, but the growing sense of unease gnawed at him. He tried to push the thoughts away, to remind himself of the woman he had loved for so many years, the woman who had been his rock through thick and thin. But the whispers around town, the hushed conversations that stopped whenever he approached, were impossible to ignore. He had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in Ashwood had. But he had refused to believe them, refused to think that Emily, his Emily, could betray him. But as the days passed, the evidence became harder to dismiss. One evening, after another long day at the mine, Daniel made a decision. He would confront Emily, ask her directly about what was going on. He deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As he drove home, the sky darkening with the approach of night, He rehearsed what he would say, how he would keep his voice steady and his anger in check. When he walked through the door, he found Emily in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. The smell of simmering vegetables and herbs filled the room, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, trying to find the right words. "Emily," he finally said, his voice low and strained. She turned to face him, her blue eyes widening slightly at the tone in his voice. "Yes, Daniel?" He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "We need to talk." She could see the determination in his eyes, the way his jaw was set, and she knew this was it. The moment she had been dreading. Her heart raced as she nodded, setting the spoon down on the counter. "Okay, let's talk." Daniel led her to the living room, where they sat down on the couch, the silence between them heavy and oppressive. He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of the woman he had once known so well. "I've been hearing things," he began, his voice calm but edged with a tension that made Emily's stomach twist. "People have been talking, saying things about you and Jack Morrison." Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She had known this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she looked down at her hands, which were trembling in her lap. "Emily," Daniel said, his voice firmer now. "Is it true? Have you been seeing him?" The weight of his words hung in the air, and Emily knew there was no point in lying anymore. The truth, as ugly and painful as it was, had to come out. She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "It's true." Daniel felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. The confirmation of what he had feared hit him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't think. The betrayal cut deeper than he had imagined, and the pain of it was almost unbearable. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do this?" Emily's tears spilled over, running down her cheeks as she struggled to find the words. "I don't know," she sobbed. "I was lonely, Daniel. You were always at the mine, and I felt like I was disappearing. Jack, he made me feel alive again." The confession tore at Daniel's heart. He had always known that his work kept him away from home too much, but he had never imagined it would lead to something like this. He had thought Emily understood, that she knew he was doing it for them, for their future. "And what about us?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What about everything we've built together?" Emily couldn't answer. She knew there was nothing she could say that would make this right, nothing that would undo the damage she had caused. All she could do was sit there, her heart breaking as she watched the man she had loved for so long crumble before her eyes. Daniel stood up suddenly, unable to sit still any longer. The room felt too small, too suffocating, and he needed to get out, to clear his head. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and turned back to Emily, his expression a mix of anger and sorrow. "I need some time to think," he said, his voice cold. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I can't be here right now." Emily nodded, too devastated to argue. She watched as he walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind him echoing in the silent house. The moment he was gone, she broke down completely, collapsing onto the couch as sobs racked her body. She had known this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier. The reality of what she had done, of how much she had hurt Daniel, was almost too much to bear. As Daniel drove aimlessly through the darkened streets of Ashwood, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, they all mixed together, leaving him feeling numb and hollow. He didn't know where he was going or what he was going to do. All he knew was that he couldn't go back to that house, not tonight. He needed time, space to think about what this meant for his marriage, for his life. Eventually, he found himself on the outskirts of town, near the old abandoned mineshaft that had claimed so many lives over the years. It was a place of death, of tragedy, and yet Daniel felt drawn to it, as if the darkness of the shaft could somehow mirror the darkness in his heart. He parked the car and got out, standing at the edge of the shaft and staring down into the inky blackness below. The night was silent, the only sound the wind whispering through the trees. As Daniel stood there, He felt the full weight of his grief settle over him. He had loved Emily with all his heart, had given her everything he could, and yet it hadn't been enough. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, and the pain of it was almost too much to bear. But as he stood there, another emotion began to take hold, one that was darker, more insidious. It was a feeling of rage, of fury at what had been taken from him. Emily had destroyed the life they had built together, had thrown away their future for a fling with a man who meant nothing. And now, as he stood on the edge of the mineshaft, Daniel felt the stirrings of a dangerous thought, one that whispered to him in the dark, telling him that there was only one way to end the pain. The thought was terrifying, but at the same time, it was strangely comforting. It offered a way out, a way to make everything right again. And as Daniel stood there, staring into the abyss, he felt the darkness begin to seep into his soul, filling the empty spaces left by Emily's betrayal. The night was long, and Daniel's thoughts were dark. But by the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, he had made up his mind. He knew what he had to do. And as he turned away from the mineshaft and headed back to town, a cold determination settled over him. The next time he saw Emily, everything would change. Forever. Descent into darkness. Emily's heart pounded as she watched Daniel drive away into the night. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She knew she had crossed a line, and the fear of what would come next gripped her tightly. But what terrified her the most was the look in Daniel's eyes before he left, a look she had never seen before, one that spoke of something broken, something irreparable. As the hours ticked by, Emily tried to distract herself by tidying up the house, but her hands trembled too much to hold anything steady. The echoes of their argument lingered in the air, replaying in her mind like a broken record. She knew she had to do something, had to find a way to fix this, but every thought led her back to the same terrifying conclusion. Daniel was gone, and she didn't know if he would ever come back. It was well past midnight when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. Emily jumped, her heart leaping into her throat as she fumbled to answer it. "Hello?" she breathed, her voice shaky. There was a pause on the other end, a moment of silence that felt like an eternity, before a voice she didn't recognize spoke. "Mrs. Harper?" "Yes, this is Emily," she replied, her stomach twisting with unease. "Who is this?" "This is Officer Brooks from the Ashwood Police Department. I'm calling to let you know that we've found your husband's truck abandoned just outside of town. Is everything all right?" The blood drained from Emily's face, her hand tightening around the phone as she struggled to process what she had just heard. "Abandoned?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Where is he?" "We're not sure yet," Officer Brooks said, his tone cautious. "We're conducting a search of the area, but we haven't found any sign of him so far. Do you have any idea where he might have gone or why he would have left his truck?" Emily's mind raced, her thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. Where would Daniel go? Why would he leave his truck? 1,000 scenarios flashed through her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. "No," she finally managed to say. I don't know where he is. He left the house after we had an argument, but I don't know where he went." There was another pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "All right, Mrs. Harper. We'll keep you updated as we continue the search. If you hear from him or think of anything that might help us find him, please let us know immediately." "I will," Emily promised, her voice shaking as she hung up the phone. She stood there for a moment, her mind reeling, before she collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not like this. The hours stretched on, each one feeling like a lifetime as Emily sat in the dark, waiting for any word, any sign of Daniel. But the phone remained silent, and the weight of the night pressed down on her, crushing her with its oppressive stillness. Finally, as dawn began to break, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her coat and keys, her hands trembling as she locked the door behind her. She had to find him. She had to know what had happened, even if it meant facing her worst fears. The drive to the location Officer Brooks had mentioned was a blur, the familiar roads of Ashwood passing by in a haze. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she neared the spot, her stomach churning with dread. When she finally saw the flashing lights of the police cars, her breath caught in her throat. She pulled over to the side of the road and got out, her legs shaking as she approached the group of officers gathered near Daniel's truck. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, spotted her and walked over, his expression grave. "Mrs. Harper?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Yes," Emily replied, her voice barely audible. "I'm Emily. Have you found him?" The officer hesitated, his eyes filled with a sadness that made Emily's heart sink even further. "We haven't found him yet, but we're expanding the search area. We've got teams combing the woods and the surrounding area. We're doing everything we can." Emily nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. I don't understand. Why would he leave his truck here? Why wouldn't he come home?" The officer sighed, glancing back at the truck. "It's hard to say. Sometimes people just need to get away, to clear their heads. But we're going to find him, Mrs. Harper. I promise you that." As the search continued, Emily could only stand there, her heart aching with every passing minute. She watched as the officers spread out, their flashlights cutting through the early morning mist as they scoured the area. The woods loomed dark and foreboding, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A deep sense of unease settled over her, the kind that crawls under your skin and refuses to let go. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as Emily waited, each second dragging into the next. The longer Daniel was missing, the more her mind raced with possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. She knew Daniel, or at least she thought she did, but the events of the past few hours had shattered that certainty. What had driven him to leave his truck here? Where could he have gone? Finally, one of the officers emerged from the woods, his expression unreadable. He walked over to where Emily was standing and gestured for her to follow him. "Mrs. Harper, we've found something. I think you should see this." Emily's heart pounded as she followed the officer into the woods, the underbrush crunching beneath their feet. The trees closed in around them, their twisted branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the rising sun. The further they walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, until it felt like the very air was thick with foreboding. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. In the center of it stood an old, abandoned mineshaft, its entrance a gaping black hole that seemed to swallow the light. The sight of it sent a chill down Emily's spine, and she instinctively took a step back. The officer stopped at the edge of the clearing, his expression grim. "This mineshaft has been abandoned for years. It's dangerous, and it's been sealed off, but it looks like someone broke through the barrier." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the mineshaft. The darkness inside seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the thought of Daniel being anywhere near it filled her with dread. "Do you think he went in there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The officer hesitated, his gaze locked on the entrance. "We don't know for sure, but we have to consider the possibility. We've called in a search team to go down and check it out, but it's going to take some time." Emily's mind raced as she stared at the mineshaft, her thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not when she was so close to losing everything. She had to find Daniel, had to bring him back before it was too late. But as she stood there, the darkness of the mineshaft seemed to reach out to her, pulling her into its depths, whispering of secrets best left buried. The officer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, snapping her out of her trance. "We're going to do everything we can to find him, Mrs. Harper. But I need you to stay calm and let us handle this. The mineshaft is dangerous, and I don't want you getting hurt." Emily nodded, though her heart was far from calm. She watched as the search team arrived, their equipment clanking as they prepared to descend into the mineshaft. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity as she waited, her breath catching with every sound, every movement. Finally, after what felt like hours, one of the search team members emerged from the mineshaft, his face pale. He spoke quietly with the officer, who then approached Emily with a heavy expression. "We've found something," he said, his voice low. It's a piece of clothing, Mrs. Harper. We believe it belongs to your husband." Emily's world tilted as the officer held out a piece of fabric, a familiar piece of fabric that she recognized instantly as part of Daniel's jacket. The sight of it was like a punch to the gut, and she swayed on her feet, her mind struggling to comprehend what it meant. "Does this mean he's down there?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. The officer's gaze softened with sympathy. "We don't know yet, but we're going to keep searching. We'll find him, I promise." As the search continued, Emily's mind spun with thoughts of what could have happened. The darkness of the mineshaft seemed to mirror the darkness in her heart, the fear that she had lost Daniel forever growing with each passing moment. But no matter how hard she tried to push it away, one thought remained, gnawing at the edges of her mind, a thought that she couldn't escape. What if she was too late? What if Daniel was already gone? The darkness of the mineshaft loomed before her, a terrifying reminder of how quickly things could change, how easily a life could slip away. And as the search team continued their work, Emily could only hope that she would find Daniel before the darkness claimed him for good.